When I first came here, I knew nothing about the origins of Highlife, and very, very few people had written anything about Highlife, including Ghanaians. It wasn't taught in the university. It was considered a subject not worthy of academic pursuit because it was associated with vagabonds. So there's not one style of Highlife. There were originally three styles of what became called Highlife. The word itself was invented in the 1920s, but it existed before then in the context of brass bands. That is the British military army brass bands, where they brought in or trained African musicians to play brass band music. So they basically hijacked brass band music and turned it into a Ghanaian form of music, much to the dislike of the British, by the way. They didn't like this at all. And then we had black sailors, sometimes black American, but mainly West African, who brought in the guitar. And this led to what some people now call palm wine music. So that's completely different. So you have the soldiers, the sailors, and then the third type of Highlife was played by the elite African ballroom dance orchestras that gradually, they were very much brainwashed by the British. They weren't playing any African music, but after a while they started to play some local tunes, and then that became called Highlife. So we had actually three completely separate contexts for the origins of Highlife. But each time it was a fusion of the African, the local, the imported coming in through the Europeans, like brass band instruments or the guitar, it's Spanish guitar, and the black American influence.
The idea of palm wine music is music made out of palm wine joints. And a palm wine joint in the olden days was usually a big tree somewhere in the middle of the village or town where people gather to, chat after a hard day's work. So any soft musical instrument that could be used in accompaniment. So it could be clappers, it could even be bottles or the calabash in which they drank the palm wine from. Wait for the palm wine tapper, and whilst they are drinking, like in the ancient Greek society, they make music, they talk about themselves, they talk about issues in the society.
The original palm wine rhythm was this one, which everybody knows now. It's universal. Ba, 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 ba. I mean, if you go to Cuba, it's one of the clave rhythms of Cuba. It's found in New Orleans as a bodhidri rhythm. It's found in West Africa, not just in Ghana. So it's actually an adaptation or a modification of a traditional African rhythm. It's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. But it's packaged in polyrhythmic time. And the one I'm now, the one in palm wine music is played in 4/4 time. So it is distinct from Western music, and it's the one that's conquered the world. Now everybody's Afro beats, everybody's dancing to this beat. But it came originally from Africa and got modified slightly.
Sewa denkum sewa, sewa denkum sewa. Anomore come jinkiran koma ena senya me wonyo. Oya denkum de, sewa denkum sewa, sewa denkum sewa. Anomore come jinkiran koma ena senya me wonyo. Oya denkum de. This is the dinkum instrument. It's an indigenous Ghanaian instrument, which is a musical tradition in total, which used to be performed by women in the Accra areas of Ghana. Palm wine music, it's supposed to be a musical tradition that people gather around and talk about issues. So it was used to communicate sensitive issues that could not be discussed openly.
The 1920s, the elite ballroom orchestras that were composed of Ghanaians, nothing to do with the Europeans here. They had taken up ballroom dancing, so they set up about 20 ballroom dance orchestras in Ghana. And at first they were only playing Western imported music, like I mean, polkas, waltzes, and so on, and American ragtime as well. And then somewhere in the 20s, they were playing this music, and the poor people would gather outside the rich clubs. They couldn't get in because they didn't have the clothes or the money. So they suddenly heard their own music, street music, being orchestrated by high-class orchestras. So they gave it the name high-class music or highlife music.
Highlife, and how it's been described by some scholars, is a fusion of musical elements from the West and that from the indigenous local resources. And for Collins, for instance, categorized them into three broad streams. So there's the brass band kind of highlife where you have Adaha and Kumkumba and its derivatives. Then you have the guitar kind of highlife where, of course, you have the guitar bands where you have palm wine music in there, and where you also have the electric guitar bands. Then there is the elite kind of swing jazz kind of, So what we can closely associate with highlife is not the elite kind of swing dance music where you have a lot of horns playing, or the brass band kind of music where it's solely brass band kind of music, but the guitar bands, and the guitar band essentially evolved out of palm wine kind of music making.
Yeah, Afrobeat was basically a fusion that started to develop in the late 60s, 1960s, between highlife music in Nigeria and Ghana with funk music, soul funk, James Brown, etc., from America. Music. We had something called funky highlife. We had Afro funk. We even had Afro rock, Osibisa, and so on. And then what happened is that the people were also giving it different names, but the one that stuck, and probably the most important contribution, was by Fela Anikulapo Kuti. But he wasn't the only one. There were several others in Nigeria and even in Ghana who were experimenting with funk and R&B fused with highlife music. Fela himself was a highlife musician, so he sort of gravitated from highlife to Afro funk. But he didn't want to use the word funk. In fact, I know where he invented the word Afrobeat, because a friend of mine was with him when it happened. Look, we've got to stop calling our music Afro-funk, because we're not beholden to James Brown. Africa has to stand on its own feet. So he called it Afrobeat. And it was very politicized. Social political commentary, live performance, of course. He was a highlife musician. He was a brilliant pianist and saxophonist. So it's quite different from the modern Afrobeats, which came later, much, much later. In fact, actually, if you think, Afrobeats appeared in 2012.
Now let's come to what the S has done to Afrobeat. And the genesis of it is trying to find a contemporary sound for radio. So every music that was being produced in Africa, probably in the late 2000s, became Afrobeat. And this was put together by a certain DJ in the UK for his show. So he named it Afrobeat. And some way, somehow, that seemed to have transformed into a genre.
I mean, the opportunities are because of the breakthrough of Afrobeats into the world market. It's going to open up all sorts of interesting doors for all sorts of different styles of African music, whether classical art music, African style, traditional music, different genres of music, whether South African music, and so on. There are so many opportunities, but you have to know all three types of African music. You have to know the traditional music, you have to know African art music, and you have to know African popular music. So I've done my bit. I'm handing it over to you guys, your generation.